again to all the panelists that are attending. I really do appreciate it. And thank you to everybody that's attending. It's a really good crowd. I'm excited that we got this turnout, and especially since this event is really kind of, not the same topics to be covered, but really replacing our private equity forum that was supposed to take place last Friday. So I'm glad we're at least able to pull something together. So I would like to start out with a few of the questions I had prepared. And as Heather said, if anything comes to mind for anybody attending, please feel free to throw questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the entire time. So we can try to get those addressed as we move on. So the first thing I would like to start with, and I'd love to get people's thoughts on, and I'll start with, I guess I'll get Peyton's response on this first, and then we can kind of move through everybody. Love to just kind of hear a little bit about how your particular city has responded, in Peyton's case, Richmond, and what has been the response from your bank, Harris Williams, and we can hear about the other banks from Rhett and Dillon as well. So Peyton, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So in Virginia, we have stay-at-home orders in place through June 10th. So in Richmond, all of us are working at home. So utilizing a lot of technology. But I think Harris Williams has done a really nice job trying to really keep lines of communication open, think about, ways that we can keep people engaged in this, unprecedented time. And at the end of the day, our number one priority is the safety and health of all of our employees and their families. So I think that, we're watching what the CDC is putting out, and, making sure that we're abiding by those guidelines, and have an emergency response team that meets every day to kind of talk through issues. And so right now, even outside of our Richmond office, we have 8 offices, and everyone is currently working from home, which luckily, we have the technology to do so, but certainly, a challenge.
And I'll follow on with that, and anybody else that can respond to this, please feel free to address this. But with most of our banks having international presence as well, has there been, I guess, strict coordination on rules and rules that have been put in place by the banks, or has there been kind of, I guess, office to office decision making autonomy placed on different offices in that sense?
Yeah, I can start. Ours originally started by office to office. Now everyone's kind of in the same boat, but I imagine that we will continue to take the approach of looking at location and determining when it's safe for each office to go back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say it's probably pretty similar at Wells. I think in the U.S. our, New York, Charlotte, San Francisco, LA, Houston, all the offices generally moved in lockstep with, I think, New York before sort of the official order of everyone to work remotely. I think they were sort of individually told by group to start doing it just because it seemed to be much worse there than most any other city. Then I know for our offices in like London, Hong Kong, a couple other international places, I think they were, depending on where it was, Hong Kong obviously moved a little earlier. London, I think, stuck around a little longer in the office, but I think for the most part, everyone is now completely working remotely. I think we technically, if I want to, I can go into the office, but there would be no one there, so.
Yeah, I think Houlihan's had a similar approach as far as global versus the United States. We are on essentially a mandatory work from home for now worldwide, though that did stair step a bit at the very beginning. I anticipate as we come out of this, hopefully, it'll probably work the same way, such that, if potentially different geographies are experiencing a different rate of infection or improvement, then those may, dictate a different back to work scenario. But for now, everybody's at home. Yeah,
it's great to hear everybody's thoughts on that. I think a lot of our discussion today will be centered around how your banks have transitioned to the work from home setting and what you have seen personally in working in a virtual work environment. Bryce, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what has Harris Williams done to transition to a work from home, and I guess what are some of the practices you've embraced in the current environment?
Sure, happy to go into that. I mean, so I guess first would maybe just touch on the type of work we're doing as well. I would say broadly across the firm, there were a handful of things that were pretty far along in the deal process, where everyone kind of locked arms and sort of took something that was on the 2-yard line and tried to push it across the finish line. Outside of that, there's a lot of things, where we've pushed pause, just given what's going on in the financial markets. And also, just, the limitations of not being able to be in person, doing diligence, just sort of tricky to think through how you might actually go through that process as well. So we've transitioned, away from a lot of what would normally be that type of day-to-day to working active deals in a way where there's preparation work that can be done in the background that you don't have to be in person for. That's all still happening virtually. And then there's obviously other ways we're spending time with clients. So as a team, those are kind of, sort of two big areas where we're spending time. And the way that we're doing it are actually our clients are adopting all the same things we're doing. And so they're all, working from home, wherever they may be as well, and trying to sort of manage, through their portfolio of whatever they're working on, just to understand how they're going to get through sort of the COVID interruption. In terms of day-to-day tactics, we're doing all the things that you would normally do. We're super focused on communication, and that's partly why everyone is online and everyone's digital with video. And so we're doing almost every meeting we can via video, just to sort of see people, because everyone misses that element of kind of coming into the office and interacting with people. And the other thing we're doing too, just to keep people sane, is we're doing little social things as well over video, like happy hours and things like that. So it's really all about maintaining connectivity while still sort of using the time as productively as we can.
Rhett, I'd love to hear your take from Houlihan's perspective. Do you have anything you could add to that?
Sure, yeah. I think Bryce did a pretty good job kind of giving an overview that would still play within Houlihan, as far as this kind of came on rather abruptly. And so those things that were very far along, there was a concerted effort to push those across, as you mentioned, and then kind of moving forward from there. The other kind of engagements that were active, but that weren't that close to maybe the finish line, those continue to be worked, but that ultimately, depends on whether they were or were not formally in market yet. A couple different decision trees that people kind of work down through to determine kind of the go forward plan while this kind of COVID-19 has everyone somewhat paused or on hold to see how things play out over the next month or two. So I think globally that's pretty similar, where I am and what I've experienced within the bank overall, and my group in particular. I would talk to a little bit of just, what maybe our bank has done internally as far as communication. Of course, we're staying in front of clients, but, starting kind of the most broad as far as our bank response, we started kind of a weekly associate and analyst call. They're separate calls. They're hosted by the corporate finance COO. So we have good corporate leadership sort of leading that. The CEO of our firm has joined that call, I think 2 out of the 5 weeks that we've now had it. So that was, important for us. And we got to hear from kind of the very top, sort of the strategy that the firm's taking on a go forward, which revolves a lot around communication internally and externally. We've had a few other executives on each of those calls that kind of have given the perspectives of maybe capital markets versus M&A and or restructuring. And then as far as locally within my group, sort of what we've done to, I guess, stay on top of what communication looks like is, like Bryce said, focusing a lot on video where able. Early in the transition, there was some education that went on kind of from the bank and down through the local group level as to how to implement those tools well. And certainly everyone is still learning that. We're getting a lot of practice internally as we prepare and continue to engage externally with clients using the same tools. And we're seeing, like Bryce said, that clients as well are working very diligently, first with kind of their own front lines to utilize their technology that they have available, but then also, with us, we're seeing kind of their skill set along with ours kind of increase as they get more comfortable with the technology that they have. And then kind of even more locally as far as my group. So I work in the healthcare group within Houlihan Lokey and in the New York City office. So the healthcare group has also instituted weekly calls. We had these prior to COVID-19 on a monthly basis as far as the entire healthcare group across the United States. So that's moved to weekly. It's led by the global head along with the other MDs. And then kind of even more locally to my New York group, we've done a kind of virtual happy hour type event every week, every 10 days or so. The group also hosted a virtual poker tournament using the Poker Face apps. That was kind of interesting. Had its own hiccups there to get everybody on, but was fun nonetheless. So trying to stay active with that. And then our New York healthcare group has a call that ranges from 3 to 5 times a week, depending on the week and what sort of is going on. So I think the key message there, hopefully from me, is just that Houlihan in general has really been communicative from the very top all the way down through sort of the local group level as we've kind of gone through this, and we continue to kind of learn how to use those tools and what the future holds every day and update that as it becomes available.
Yeah, I'd say
Thanks, Rhett.
similarly, we almost identical in terms of the sort of broader call with the junior bankers. We've had something very similar, which I think has been helpful for myself and for, I guess, anybody else who wasn't in the world of financial markets during the great financial crisis. So we have a lot of folks who, I would say senior guys, but you don't have to be particularly senior to have been working at that time. So it's interesting just to hear their perspectives on sort of what the similarities and differences are and what we can sort of expect going forward. And sort of, I guess, more so highlighting what the major differences are between this current situation and sort of the 2008 to 2009 timeframe. So I think that's helpful. And I think in terms of the type of work, to Bryce's point, I think there were multiple processes that unfortunately kind of got put on hold. But I think with how sort of back and forth the markets have been, there's almost every day a sort of changing of the tides in terms of what people's opinions are on when they might be able to complete something. So if you had said 3 weeks ago, like, we might have to push this acquisition out till 2021, in 2 weeks from now, that could completely change, just kind of depending on how quickly different sort of state and local governments are reopening, national government, everything in that realm. So one area that we have seen a huge pickup in is just sort of the liquidity focused credit asks. So I mean, every sort of restaurant company, which I cover consumer and retail, so in the restaurant world, every major restaurant company has been sort of trying to boost their balance sheet, trying to raise debt in some capacity to sort of be able to get through the crisis. So we've been very active and busy there, but on the M&A front, there are a lot of processes that kind of got put on the sidelines for now.
Thanks for that. And Peyton, I wonder if you could dig in a little more specifically to what skills you've had to focus on in succeeding in this type of environment. And I'll add on to that question too. And like, what types of skills and focus points do you expect from other people in your team to be aware of as well, so that you can have productive engagements and productive meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that everyone's really hit on, but communication has just been super important to maintain connectivity, understand what's going on. Yeah, I think another thing is just maintaining a structure to the day. It's really easy for all the days to kind of blend together, and so trying to structure it out, build in breaks, step away from your computer so you don't just wake up and realize you've been sitting there for 12 hours is really crucial. And then just thinking about not necessarily with with my team, but maybe advice for people who are starting out, is it's kind of easy to lose the level of professionalism when you're on these WebEx calls. And I think that that's something just to keep in mind, especially as people are starting internships and stuff, is that, you know, even though you're virtual, just maintaining that level of professionalism will be super important.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to another one of our questions. Do you have any must-dos or must-don'ts for some of our students that are going to be in virtual internships for the summer, or even starting out virtual for full-time roles? What types of expectations do senior members of the Harris-Williams team have for people coming in? And I'm sure those expectations apply across all banks.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to be challenging to network the way that you would be able to if you were in the office and, you know, kind of just able to stop by people's offices, make those connections. So I think, you know, being vocal, whether it's to your recruiter or someone on your school team, like, hey, I'm really interested in XYZ, would you mind making an introduction? I think that is going to be really important to make sure that you're still building those relationships over the course of the 10 weeks and getting to know people. And then again, just remembering that any kind of FaceTime really makes a difference. So if you can do a WebEx versus just a phone call, I think that goes a long way during the internship.
And we can start with Rhett for this next question, but I'd love to get your thoughts on, you know, what types of work habits and work streams might stick from this environment going forward, and do you see the way we work within investment banks or in financial services firms in general, do you see it adapting to this, or just going back to how we were before completely?
No, I mean, I think a lot of positive changes will come out of this. Luckily, I mean, right now, Harris-Williams, we don't really have a FaceTime culture, and I think this is proving that you don't need to have that, that people can be productive from their living rooms. But I think it's also shown people that they want to be in the office and have that sense of connectivity. But I think that I think we will continue to use technology for in a positive way, and just kind of hits home that you can go home at 7 o'clock and plug back in and still be able to kind of be productive while also taking that time to see your family.
Happy to pick up from there. I think most of that, you know, I agree with, and I think that overall our firm has just gotten more comfortable using technology over the past few weeks, and so I think that comfort will translate probably in a few different ways. Mostly internally, I see, you know, it opening up this idea of maybe inter-office communication now being a virtual video versus a phone call, whereas before we were pretty exclusively phone calls if it was, you know, across offices. And I could see some use of video kind of on a go-forward basis there. I do think, you know, a lot of our clients are also becoming more savvy with technology throughout this sort of period of time. And I think that, you know, there's some ways in which that might mean that we communicate with them differently, but I also have seen that it's meant in a lot of cases that they communicate with their customers differently and conduct business differently. And I think in some ways that will make some differences in how we approach our clients and how we approach kind of the sale process or raising capital, et cetera, based on the way that they do now kind of conduct business with their own customers. So that's kind of way downstream. A little closer to home is another, you know, internally I see our communication increasingly using video. I think with clients though, it has reiterated or reinforced kind of the importance of in-person in some situations, whether that be management meetings or diligence calls, as Bryce mentioned, and work, et cetera, is you know, it's quite difficult to do remote or virtually. So I think we've seen some of that kind of be reinforced in terms of the importance of in-person, and you know, otherwise maybe that wouldn't have been the case. It's kind of what I've seen so far.
And Dylan or Bryce, if maybe y'all could expand on this a little bit. Coming from my role before business school, I was a financial advisor with Morgan Stanley, and there was a very, very sluggish uptake of technology, and a lot of it due to various regulations and constraints on how we share data. Have you seen any constraints from a regulatory perspective in working in this new environment, or have Wells Fargo and Harris Williams been able to adjust to this normal pretty readily?
Yeah, I'll let Bryce address it for them, but I think for us, we've definitely received a lot of communications around sort of just reinforcing what was already understood and known, and sort of just almost a reminder, like pay extra close attention to even who is around when you're saying things. So I know everyone's supposed to be social distancing, whatever, but some people might have a family member staying with them or something. And not that I think my in-laws or my wife or anybody's going to go do some sort of insider trading on something they overhear in a phone call of mine, but I know there were even concerns around Amazon Echo devices, just people having those throughout their houses and potentially recording things sort of unintentionally. So I think we definitely received some communications around that. I wouldn't say that we've had any specific procedural changes. I think there's just been a lot of sort of reinforcement of, hey, this is a slightly more casual, I guess, environment for a lot of people in that they're working from home, but sort of the same rules apply. And even simple things like we all have sort of work issued iPhones. So if you're dialing into a diligence call, dial in from that. Don't use your personal phone just because it's closer to you or something. Just simple things like that. And I think one downside that, and maybe guys at the other banks are doing this or have the ability to, but like we can't print anything while we are sort of working remotely, which is fortunately or unfortunately a big change. I think a lot of people print regularly, and there's a lot of sort of paper traffic going on in the offices of a lot of banks. I, for one, prefer not to have the paper, so it's fine for me, but a lot of our more senior folks, I think, are used to doing that. So that's sort of a hindrance on them, but also probably aids from a compliance perspective that they aren't able to unintentionally leave a bunch of papers sitting around anywhere.
Yeah, I think maybe from an adjustment perspective, there may have been sort of some inconveniences around the, on the margin over the past several weeks, but largely, no sort of like regulatory or compliance issues that I'm aware of coming up. Everyone has gotten online pretty quickly, and our IT team has been great about just making sure that everyone's got sort of, secure communication across iPhones, iPads, laptops, all that. So it's been good.
Great. And Peyton, we'll go to you for this next question. One common thread that I've heard from a lot of our students is wanting to maybe hear what other banks are doing as far as the structure of summer internships, mainly because they just want to know if their situation is an outlier, or hoping maybe you can provide a little bit of color on what you're hearing from an industry-wide perspective, and if you feel all right going forward with what Harris Williams is doing specifically. How are you hearing that internships are being structured for the coming summer?
Yeah, I think that banks are starting to kind of communicate their plans, within the last couple of weeks. And I think it's a mix. I've seen some banks that are going 100% virtual, some that are kind of making it optional, some who have deferred or given the choice to defer the internship for a year. So it really kind of runs the gamut. For Harris Williams, we haven't made the final call yet on what we're going to do. But given that Virginia has stay-at-home orders through June 10th, and our internship is supposed to start June 8th, I think it's unlikely that we'll be able to start on time, and we will make the call over the next week or so. So now we've been kind of thinking through how would we run a virtual internship, what would it look like, and what would we put in place to make sure that we are able to really give our interns a solid experience, where we also feel like we can evaluate them, and that, we're conveying our culture, they're able to meet people, all of those things. So we're still kind of thinking through all of that. But I think each bank is just kind of handling it differently, and it's, unfortunately, the situation is constantly changing, and so it makes it difficult to make the decision. But right now, I would say the majority of banks that I'm hearing of, at least, are moving to a virtual format and shortening their internships accordingly.
Sure. And a quick follow-up to that, do you see any plans being placed for full-time roles, or are most banks right now just focused on getting the internship settled and then dealing with the full-time role in the next few weeks?
Yeah. So right now, I think that people are very focused on the internship, and luckily, our full-time program doesn't start until July, so we've got a little bit more time with that. And so we're kind of waiting to see what the next few weeks bring, one way or the other. I mean, at least for Harris Williams, we have analysts that are departing at the end of July, and so we don't want to have too much of a gap when they leave and our new people start. So trying to think through that, but also make sure that we can, if we do have to do our training program virtually, how will we do that? And then also, once training is finished, how will we make sure that people are meaningfully engaged so that they're not losing everything that they learned during training?
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to everybody in attendance, feel free to put any questions in the chat, and we'll address those here over the next 15 or 20 minutes. One thing I wanted to go back into a little bit more, and Dylan mentioned a little bit regarding consumer, but Rhett, I'd love to hear a little bit more about healthcare specific. What are you seeing from client companies? Is business in that arena still going as usual? I mean, it seems like healthcare might be a little bit more resilient or even picking up in an environment like this. Love to hear your thoughts on overall valuations as a result of what could be either an uptick in activity or a potential decrease.
Yeah, sure. I think as you sort of dig one layer below sort of the overarching umbrella of healthcare, you find that the clients are all quite different. And so for those that are more services oriented, if they have heavy exposure to elective procedures, I'm sure everyone's kind of heard or seen that most of those have been put on hold, at least for the time being, across, pretty much all of healthcare. And so if you have exposure there, that's a different kind of impact than someone who's primarily a healthcare technology or tech-enabled services firm that, as you mentioned, may still be seeing a more typical book of business during this period of time. I will say that, at least, immediately following sort of the massive changes that society has undertaken as we've come to grips with sort of COVID-19, a lot of healthcare institutions, even those that are open, have completely reorganized the business that they're running as they attempt to prepare for what could be sort of the influx of patients and the severity of those patients, and just what the future holds is so unclear for even them that they don't often look today like they did just a few months ago, even if they aren't an elective procedure type healthcare services firm. And so ultimately, I would say globally, everyone is very much just in a, doing the very best that they can to understand the situation for their particular business as it pertains to this current and present time, while hoping that on, some point in the near future, hopefully, but in the future in general, that they will be able to get back to sort of business as usual. But the majority of firms that are out there, I think even within healthcare, have experienced pretty significant change over the past month. which, you know, as you mentioned, I think generally whether you're in school or otherwise just reading, you hear that healthcare is a little bit more non-cyclical in that way. And traditionally that's true. It's even more ironic that what we're suffering from is a healthcare exogenous shock. And, you know, even still, it's proving to have a pretty important impact on healthcare businesses overall. So we've seen it be fairly wide ranging, but I would say that generally there's been pretty significant changes across most of the businesses that are out there. That's kind of what we've seen.
Great,
there.
Thank you. Bryce, love to get your take on similar question in the viewpoint of business services.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, similarly across the types of companies we cover, we're seeing a little bit of everything. There are some instances where portfolio companies are becoming really, really stressed, depending on the nature of the service they're providing, particularly if it's something where you may need to have close physical contact with the customer, or access into commercial office space, something like that, where maybe that's been restricted depending on the geography. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where maybe it's more of a technology-based service, and it's B2B, and it's sort of continuing to plug along to the extent that its customers are as well, although everyone still sort of adopting a work from home environment, which, as you'd imagine, as everyone on sort of this call, myself, Peyton, Rhett, and Dylan have been discussing, every one of our clients is sort of having to morph their business in the same way. And I think actually, from a comparison perspective, the transition has probably been relatively easy for those in the banking world who sort of use all the tools and the technology in one way or another at night or on the weekends already, compared to maybe some businesses that where their workforce was not as facile with all that prior. So I'd say we've seen the full spectrum, and to Rhett's point, I'm not sure anyone has a great handle on how everything will play out, and so we're seeing a lot of game planning for multiple scenarios and sort of lengths of time of the disruption.
Great. And a follow-on to that, for portfolio companies that are struggling, how are you seeing private equity firms responding to that situation? Are they needing to step up and provide more of a backstop for these companies that are struggling, or how do you see those clients taking care of the situation?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of dynamics at play, but I think what's been interesting, particularly the latter 2 weeks of March, there was a lot of stress in the credit markets, even around businesses that were continuing to perform just fine. And so that, I think, has created a lot of angst for folks, but it sort of hasn't changed the view on what were otherwise considered very good businesses that continue to perform well. And so we're seeing, lots of activity around sponsors. One, just communicating that broadly, and then two, some we've even seen, if all of a sudden you've got a big piece of debt and it's trading at 80 cents and it's worth 100 because you're running the business. We've seen some activity in the credit markets as well, where people are buying that back in. The other things, that we haven't seen much of yet, but would expect sort of as you look towards end of the second quarter here in June, and then into the third quarter, as all the June debt payments start creeping up on people, to the extent that there are nice businesses that have a temporary cash crunch, I would expect to see a lot of, not necessarily restructuring, but potential for structured equity investments and other creative tools like that to sort of come out, to allow private equity to put more capital to work in really good businesses that maybe just have a temporal issue related to COVID.
Great, thank you. And Dylan, do you have any other thoughts you want to add regarding the consumer world?
Yeah, sort of just to Bryce's last point there around sort of strategic investments in our world, again, in sort of the restaurant space. So Cheesecake Factory just this morning received an investment from a company called Rourke Capital. It's a private equity firm that focuses mostly on restaurants. If you've ever been to a Buffalo Wild Wings, Arby's, Wendy's, at some point or another, they've owned part or all of those. So they made a $200 million investment in Cheesecake Factory this morning. which, as you can imagine, Cheesecake Factory is one of many restaurants whose sort of dine-in is completely shut down right now, and has therefore taken a large hit. But I think investments like that are opportunistic for those sponsors, and also sort of shows, I guess, sort of tipping their hand as to what types of concepts, what types of restaurants and management teams they trust to sort of get through this crisis versus others, because I think there are a lot of companies that would willingly take an investment like that at this point. It's just a matter of those who hold the capital, who they want to invest in. So another large area, obviously, is sort of just the retail space more broadly. So we've done a lot of analysis just around how some of the larger retail players like Home Depot, Lowe's, anyone in that sort of industry, what sort of their strategy was going into the great financial crisis, how they approached that differently, how they performed, and then how they came out the other side of that to give some of our other clients insight as to what they might want to consider doing. For the most part, it's in most basic terms, for a lot of companies, it's just about having enough cash or enough available liquidity to get through it, and to be able to, if you're a restaurant or a retailer that has furloughed your workforce, which some of these have furloughed. If you sort of look at basically who's left, it's like the corporate employees, but all the retail employees are on furlough. Are they going to come back when this is over? Do they have an incentive to, or are they going to look for other jobs? And I think for a lot of companies, they tout their great culture and say that everybody will come back, but I think that kind of remains to be seen. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in the next couple of weeks, couple of months.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you brought up. I appreciate that. One thing that Rhett mentioned, that COVID-19 being an exogenous shock to the system. One thing, and I know none of you specifically focus on oil and gas, but another exogenous shock coming in down the pike right now is the fact that oil prices this morning are almost going to zero, for lack of better positioning of it. Do any of you see an effect like that feeding into the specific industry that you're working in any shape or form? Or if you want to speak more broadly to what may be other coverage groups within your firms that a shock like that might potentially have.
I think I know, in sort of, it's a space that I haven't done much in consumer and retail, but sort of the distribution arena, particularly when it comes to things that we're all trying to use right now, which is food retail in terms of grocery stores and restaurants. Just thinking about sort of the companies that rely on getting food either around the world or across the country right now. So think about companies like Cisco, for example. I think for them, things like oil price declines like this can be great. Obviously, there's both a supply and a demand side to that, but I think it'll fundamentally change how they're trying to do their business right now. But again, a lot of these companies have so many hedging instruments in place that are far beyond the scope of my understanding. But I think they are to some degree prepared for things like this. But I think the magnitude of this is potentially beyond what a lot of them were prepared for. So hopefully they had good sort of internal corporate finance and treasury teams preparing them for that with various derivative hedges. But I know the folks in our oil and gas teams have been, I guess, busy in some ways and not busy in others, but definitely fielding a lot of inquiries from clients over the last few weeks.
Great, thank you for that. One question that just came in from the chat from Nitish. Do you think restructuring and debt capital markets will continue to be in high demand for the mid to long term? And then follow on to that, would Harris Williams or Wells Fargo consider further building a restructuring practice?
I'm happy to start. I can just give you my personal views on restructuring. I mean, I think there are some clear cases, just going back to the oil example, where the price of oil is, which is not necessarily entirely related to COVID, but there's obviously some geopolitical aspects at play there. The question of whether the price of oil is at a level that makes shale profitable or not, is going to dictate restructuring in that sector, right? So that may occur regardless. I think as you think about the economy at large, what the government through its fiscal stimulus and also the Fed through all of its actions are trying to do, is exactly what Dylan alluded to, which was enable the system to have enough liquidity so that individuals, both consumers and businesses, can navigate through what most hope and believe can be sort of a temporary cash crunch. And if it can do that effectively enough, you might actually prevent a lot of the structural damage that's going to happen through bankruptcy events. And so I think it's yet to be seen. It's a little bit different than the financial crisis, because once firms, financial firms that were interconnected across the globe started to fail, we very early on had a lot of that structural damage, sort of taking its course. Here, I think the jury is still out on what the extent and the magnitude of any structural damage will be. And so I think we'll have to watch it play out. And I think Dylan's example that he brought up on Cheesecake Factory is interesting, because to the extent that strategic investors can come in, and help support balance sheets, that'll be important as well. And then I guess just to comment on your question about Harris Williams specifically, I don't think we have any plans right now necessarily to start a sort of a new restructuring practice, but yeah.
Yeah, I think at Wells, I know I've seen some internal communications around restructuring and sort of focusing, I wouldn't say more so on building a practice, but more so on sort of call it like an internal community of advisors, more or less. So folks who have experience in that sort of sit within, for the most part, the M&A team, and I guess M&A and leverage finance teams, and sort of focusing on what they can bring to sort of individual one-off scenarios, but haven't seen anything on our end around sort of building out an official practice per se. From a debt capital markets perspective, I think I don't sit in that group. I do have plenty of friends over there, and I know they have all been, it was sort of a weird lull when, I guess, mid to late February when COVID-19 was sort of taking off or becoming, I guess, having more broad impacts in the U.S. initially. Everything was sort of at a standstill for them, and since then it's been sort of pedal to the metal for them in terms of just every day there are new issuances and different sort of parts of the debt markets being reopened. And by that, I mean, just looking at like the high yield markets, if you had tried to go to a high yield market as a consumer retail company a month ago, you might not have been able to do that. But I know in the past week and a half or so, I've personally been involved with quite a few different issuances, and I think that will definitely continue for the foreseeable future. So in terms of actually building out that practice, I don't know that they would attempt to sort of staff up, because the downside there is by the time you do that, then do you have a bunch of people sitting around that don't have enough to do? So I know they are all very, very occupied at the moment, but don't know if they'll plan on building that out anymore. And Wells in particular does have a pretty heavy focus on the debt market, so our teams are already pretty sizable there.
Before we move to the next question, Rhett, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think they covered it pretty well. Obviously, Houlihan does have a restructuring arm, and they are, one would anticipate that would be busier on a go forward given the current situation, both with oil and COVID-19. Though I think, as Bryce mentioned, among others, the reality is this just happened so fast, and we're still sort of watching dominoes continue to fall and wait on others to fall. So I think there's definitely still some wait and see, and a lot of the available capital that was out there, whether it be through revolvers or other, private equity investing into public markets, et cetera, have meant that there's not, I guess ultimately it's still sort of a wait and see right now to a certain degree, but anticipate that there will be more restructuring business rather than less on a go forward near term.
Sure. And Peyton, going on to the next questions in the chat, and maybe not necessarily just from the perspective of investment banking, but maybe financial services in general. What are your thoughts on anybody that may be looking for just-in-time recruiting for full-time roles right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of companies are, kind of evaluating their hiring needs. Obviously, in banking, it's done pretty far out. We're looking at 2021 at this point. So I think for banking, the best thing you can do at this point is just make the connections so that when there is a need that arises, you're kind of top of mind. There is still some recruiting going on, and I think a lot of companies are promoting that through, LinkedIn or other hiring platforms. But I think really leveraging, your network is the best way to kind of put your foot forward and be in the best position when something does open up. Unfortunately, I think probably a lot of companies are hitting pause on hiring right now, but not all. So, networking is the best thing you can do at this point, I'd say.
Great, thank you. And with that, we are running up on the cap for what is our Owen lunch hour. People will be running to their 2 o'clock classes by, I guess, clicking over to the next window. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists, especially for being here. Thank you for everybody that was in attendance. As Heather mentioned, we did record this, so we'll be available for you to view afterwards. But if you do have any follow-up questions, you have my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me, and if I can't answer it, then I will get input from our panelists, and we'll get some thoughts to you. So with that, thank you again, everybody. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it.